right, so we have come to the end of Unit 3, our respiratory and pulmonary physiology unit. So what we will discuss in this module is respiratory regulation and respiratory responses. So to start, exercise physiologists have been studying respiratory regulation for years, but some questions still remain. So with a lot of topics that we talk about in this class, we have a pretty good mechanistic understanding of what's going on, but we just need a little bit more research to really make those definitive statements that this is actually what's happening. So how is respiration controlled? Well, we know that breathing is involuntary. So we can actually control breathing. You can purposefully breathe. You can either breathe more shallow or more deeply. So even though it's involuntary, you can control your respiration, and you can also hold your breath. So even though respiration is involuntary, you can control your breathing. Now, whenever you exercise, when more oxygen is needed, your brain signals to your lungs to increase your respiratory rate, as well as increasing the volume of air. So you're going to end up breathing deeper. So in this regulation of breathing, we know that the medulla oblongata, this is always fun to say, really establishes the regular pattern of breathing. So we have receptor cells near the respiratory center respond to changes caused by increases in our arterial carbon dioxide. We also have receptors in the carotid and aortic bodies that respond to these large decreases in arterial oxygen, as well as these higher centers in the cortex that can exert conscious control over respiration. So this is a little bit of anatomy and physiology intertwined into the regulation of breathing. So let's go ahead and fill out this worksheet. So the objective of regulation of respiration is to maintain normal levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in arterial blood. So the three basic elements that control the respiratory control center. So we have our central controller. And what makes up this element is our brain stem cortex. And at rest, this is important, the chemical state of blood controls ventilation because we are trying to maintain normal levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in arterial blood. So at rest, the chemical state of blood controls ventilation. So let's go ahead and come down here to number 1, where we're going to have sensors that are going to have input to our control center that will help to maintain and control ventilation. So there's 2 types of chemoreceptors. We have central chemoreceptors that control oxygen, and then that control carbon dioxide, and then we have peripheral that control our oxygen. And what acts to fine-tune ventilation during exercise? I'll answer that at the end of this lecture. So we also have other receptors. So what are some differences between afferent and efferent? We know some of these carry info to the central nervous system and others carry this information away. So then on sort of the right-hand side of this, we have outputs as well. And these outputs are called our effectors. These are things like the diaphragm, your your intercostal muscles, and accessory muscles that also make up these outputs. So we have another thing down here of what are mechanoreceptors? So these are sort of what we call sense organs. They sense and respond to changes in stimuli. So this is just sort of a nice schematic here to start our conversation on the regulation of respiration. So again, just sort of to review ventilation at rest. So at rest, remember the chemical state of blood controls ventilation. So with our pulmonary ventilation at rest, we're going to draw out a few of this. Let's start with okay, it's going to look similar idea to this, but maybe we'll simplify it a little bit. So in the center, in our control center, we have a brain stem. So this is our respiratory control center. We know that we have central chemoreceptors that detect changes in our carbon dioxide. We also have peripheral chemoreceptors that detect changes in oxygen in the heart and the skeletal muscle. Along with our control center, we also have our diaphragm, and then directly tied to our ventilation or our actual breathing. So as with everything physiologically, quite a few things have to sort of line up and be perfect in order for these outputs like breathing to actually occur. So we have some input to the respiratory control center. We have afferent nerves and we have some efferent nerves. So let's talk a little bit about some receptors. We have neural receptors, and these are inputs for breathing. And we also have humoral. So these sort of blood-borne receptors. And so the influence of blood-borne stimuli reaches these chemoreceptors. So we're talking about norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is sort of that fight or flight response. And that also plays into input into the respiratory control center. Now we've introduced this idea of chemoreceptors. We have said that there are two types of chemoreceptors. One is in the central brain. In physiology, when we talk about central control, we're talking about the brain. When we talk about peripheral sort of output, we're talking about skeletal muscle, heart, liver, lungs, kidney, everything but the brain. So we have central and we have peripheral. So the action of these central chemoreceptors in the brain, they are sensitive to increases in hydrogen ion concentration. And so these hydrogen ions stimulate a group of respiratory centers that then signal to increase breathing rate and force of breathing. So that's one way to control it. The second is peripheral. For this example, we'll talk about the heart. So these peripheral chemoreceptors in the heart are particularly in the right ventricle. And what they do is they detect large changes in oxygen. And so between these central and peripheral chemoreceptors, this is another way to discuss the input and sort of the control of the respiratory sort of center. So a different type of receptor is the mechanoreceptor. And this can also be found in the right ventricle. And this will send afferent information back to the respiratory control center. And the point of this is to increase cardiac output. So we'll learn in the next lecture that cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. So really what we're talking about with mechanoreceptors is they are providing information on blood pressure and cardiovascular respiratory control centers to really help us with our breathing. What's also interesting are these stretch receptors of the lung. So they provide information on lung stretching and respiratory rhythmicity to also help control respiratory rate. So I just want to give a little bit of examples to the different types of chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors. Now, in talking about exercise, we know that when we begin to exercise, we have an increase in breathing rate from a resting state. So we know that the brain is our central sort of control and primary drive to increase our breathing rate during exercise. We also have these respiratory control centers in the skeletal muscle. We also have peripheral chemoreceptors, as well as our respiratory muscles. And so this question that we posed in the beginning of lecture of what acts to fine-tune ventilation during exercise, actually the skeletal muscles. Pretty cool. All right, so let's go ahead and finish up this unit discussing respiratory responses. So in talking about respiratory responses to exercise, we'll do a little bit of a review, which I think will help when you take your final exam, which will be on units 2 and 3. So let's go ahead and we're going to redraw time here in minutes. Let's go from 0 to 5 to 10. And let's revisit pulmonary ventilation here on our x-axis, where we usually peak at about 150, sometimes 200 if you're an elite athlete. Okay, so I'm going to draw this maybe a little bit differently than I did the last time. I'm going to talk about exercising here, ending our exercise. Oh, fun. I learned how to draw something new. So this is going to be our exercise time. And as we start to think about light exercise, and moderate exercise, and then we'll really exaggerate here for some heavy exercise. We know that as exercise intensity increases, our pulmonary ventilation will also increase. So starting exercise and ending exercise. And a few things to just remind you of. At rest, our pulmonary ventilation is about 6 liters per minute. At moderate intensity exercise, it's about 75 liters per minute. And then at heavy intensity exercise, it's about 150 liters per minute. So those are just some averages and sort of some guides for that as well. So in talking about the neural and sort of chemical control of breathing, for neural, we have stretch receptors in the lungs. And these send messages to the brain center to alter breathing rate. We also know that we have these chemical states that will sense changes of oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have baroreceptors and mechanoreceptors, and so these stimulus rely on feedback and information to your brain that we just discussed in the few slides before this. So let's talk about some of these 4 acute respiratory responses to exercise. First, we'll have an increase in tidal volume, we'll have an increase in respiratory rate, we'll have an increase in ventilation, and we'll have an increase in gas exchange and diffusion. So with this increase in oxygen uptake and an increase in CO2 removal, our whole goal is to increase aerobic ATP production to be able to produce energy at aerobically higher intensities. So we'll spend some time breaking each of these down. And again, this is another kind of good review lecture. I would come back and rewatch this last part as you prepare for the final. So if we have an increase in tidal volume, this means that we are increasing the amount of air in and out of our lungs. So at rest, our pulmonary ventilation is about 0.5 liters. And then at exercise, we can get up to about 5 liters per minute. This colorful picture here on the right is just to remind you about spirometry and tidal volume and our total lung capacities that we discussed in a few lectures prior. So let's talk about respiratory rate or breathing rate. So we are talking about an increase in the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. So as you exercise, your respiratory rate will increase. And this will be influenced by sympathetic nerves. They will stimulate your respiratory muscles to increase your breathing rate. So remember, your respiratory rate at rest is about 12, or your breathing rate is about 12 to 14 breaths per minute. Whereas exercise, you can be anywhere from about 30 to 50 breaths per minute. So it's important to remember that increasing your respiratory rate allows more oxygen to reach your lungs, which means more blood delivered to your working muscles to help generate ATP to fuel aerobic metabolism. So just to review and sort of remind you about these typical values of ventilation during rest and moderate and vigorous exercise, remember breathing rate times tidal volume will equal pulmonary ventilation. So we've discussed that breathing rate at rest is 12 breaths per minute. Moderate exercise is about 30 breaths per minute. Vigorous exercise is up to 50. Our tidal volume at rest is 0.5. 2.5 for moderate, and 3.0 for vigorous. If we do the math out for that, we get 6 liters per minute for rest, 75 liters per minute for moderate exercise, and then 150 liters per minute for vigorous exercise. And that corresponds exactly with this graph that we drew up here, talking about pulmonary ventilation. So just quickly to remind you about pulmonary ventilation, we know that it's breathing rate times tidal volume. So if you increase breathing rate and you increase tidal volume, you will increase pulmonary ventilation, which is great for us when we exercise. So in talking about oxygen transport for diffusion, for this we are talking about gas exchange. So what we want to do is meet oxygen demands for our working muscles. And we will also have additional oxygen to be transported through blood vessels. Now, during exercise, we will have sympathetic nerve stimulate and innervate the nerves in your heart. This will increase stroke volume by about 30 to 40%, sort of setting the stage for our final unit. So we know that cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate, and we will revisit this in our final unit. But sympathetic nerves will also increase heart rate. So this will help to expand the lungs with baroreceptors. It's going to widen bronchial passages. So again, this is sort of that nice relationship between our cardiovascular system and our pulmonary system. So let's end this unit by talking about long-term responses to exercise. So for this slide, we are talking about chronic exercise. So that's, weeks to months up to years. And so physiological adaptations are generally going to result in overall efficiency of the respiratory system. Kind of broad and basic, but we basically want to deliver oxygen to working muscles. And long-term training will definitely increase the overall efficiency of our physiological ability to be able to do that. And how do we measure this? Well, we measure this by VO2 max. That is how we measure it. So this, remember, VO2 max is the body's ability to utilize oxygen. So through exercise training, we can improve our respiratory response to a point, right? We've talked a lot about in this unit how we're not going to have big grand improvements, but swimmers will if they train. But basically, our long-term response to exercise is just sort of an overall efficiency of our respiratory system. So that concludes Unit 3. Okay, I'll see you for the final unit, our cardiovascular unit. Thanks.